Welcome to Inbox Roundup number 18. Today we're going to talk about Americans joining the Russian army, wildfires in Hawaii and whether that affects readiness, President Putin's popularity, and do we underestimate his army, battleship guns being sent to Ukraine, can the U.S. declare war on Wagner, would a winter campaign against Russian defenses be better, and does everything devolve into trench warfare? Before I get started, I'm filming this a few days early. I'm at Fort Campbell, Kentucky right now with the 101st Airborne Division, so this video is set to auto-publish. And I'm turning right back around and doing an amphibious landing with the Marine Corps on an LCAC. So this should be a fun week. But this fun week isn't cheap. I spent about $2,000 getting all the gear I needed for this trip, but at least I have it for other embeds. So if you can toss me $5 by joining my Substack, buy a t-shirt for Bunker Branding, get a cameo greeting from the person in your life who loves the channel, I'd really appreciate that. Let's get started. Ben asks, I'm a natural-born American citizen. Would I be able to volunteer to fight for the regular Russian army or a Russian proxy militia like the Wagner Group without fear of punishment from the U.S. government? Well, I'm not a lawyer, so I reached out to a few lawyers to answer this question. Now, a couple of things. Russia is a sovereign state, and normally joining a foreign military doesn't necessarily trigger any U.S. government sanctions unless very specific statutes are violated, and I'm going to get to that in a second. For a good example, Jewish Americans join the Israeli army all the time. Wagner is a different animal. Wagner is a transnational criminal organization, and there's currently sanctions against Wagner. So if you do join Wagner, you could be subject to those sanctions. Now, the Department of Justice has the burden to prosecute here, but what they can pull out is something called RICO, the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. It's basically this catch-all law that can hold you responsible for the crimes of others if there's a sustained criminal scheme. Tony Soprano, he was deathly afraid of RICO. So the bottom line is that I would not advise you joining the Russian army as an American. Number one, your life expectancy is short. And number two, it could put you in proximity to war crimes, which could be prosecuted by the U.S. at a later date. But remember I talked about specific statutes? Now, if you do decide to join the Russian army, don't join a surface-to-air missile unit because that's where those specific statutes come in. Specifically, 18 U.S.C. 2332G states, except as provided in paragraph 3, it shall be unlawful for any person to knowingly produce, construct, or otherwise acquire, transfer directly or indirectly, receive, possess, import, export, or use, or possess, and threaten to use an explosive or incendiary rocket or missile. I strongly suggest that you do not join the Russian army. There really is no future in that. Adams asks, we have lots of naval and cybersecurity assets in Hawaii. How will this disaster affect our national interests in Hawaii and the rest of the Pacific? What types of mitigation are in effect to weather this storm? Will this impact East Coast cybersecurity efforts? So for those of you who don't know, the Hawaiian island of Maui had a massive wildfire, killed about 100 people, and we're still looking for more casualties. I don't believe that the fires on Maui would affect either U.S. naval readiness or cyber readiness because the fires are on Maui and most of the U.S. military presence is on Oahu. The military has been helping with this. Specifically, the Hawaiian National Guard has their Chinooks. They've been dropping water on fires. They've been setting up aid stations and helping people out. I mean, that's what the U.S. National Guard is, neighbors helping neighbors. So in this case, the pilots are getting their hours in, which they need anyway, and that's good for readiness. And the people of Maui are being assisted by the National Guard. The National Guard soldiers are getting to do their jobs, so that's good for readiness. But as for cyber and the Navy, again, all the data centers are also on Oahu, and so is Pearl Harbor. So I really don't see the wildfires as an issue for naval or cyber readiness. Next, Daniel asks, one thing I see in a lot of places is the impression that Putin isn't actually popular in Russia, and the only reason for staying in power is rigging elections. I think this is a rather dangerous view to take. I also think that the rather popular view that Russian military is a joke is also very dangerous. That's another subject entirely. So I don't know much about Russian politics, so here's Russian journalist Ksenia Turkova to give you an answer.
According to the numbers of the recent polls, Vladimir Putin is still very popular in Russia. Here is the data of sociological companies about Putin's rating for July 9th, 2023. The state-run VCIOM Center reports that Putin's rating is 77%. The Public Opinion Foundation gives us the number of 75, and the independent sociological center Levada, labeled as a foreign agent, by the way, gives the highest one, 81%. In addition, Levada Center sociologists found out that Russians generally have become more accepting of Putin, and the number of those who admire him has tripled. Respondents were also asked what they disliked about Putin's actions. Most people answered that they did not like the increase in the retirement age. No one recalled wars, repressions, and persecution of the opposition. Only 6% of respondents said they thought Putin was a tyrant. But can sociological polls be trusted in a dictatorship? Russian political analyst Stanislav Belkovsky believes that such polls reflect a crisis of sociological data. In his opinion, the audience does not broadcast its own point of view, but gives sociologists the answers the Kremlin wants to hear. Belkovsky believes that people are simply afraid of answering incorrectly. A number of other analysts agree with Belkovsky. In addition, they point to indirect signs that support for the authorities is not that high in Russia now. First, now Russians use patriotic symbols much less frequently than they did in 2014 after the annexation of Crimea. The half swastika Z is not very popular. Secondly, Russians are increasingly using VPN services. The number of VPN users in Russia has grown 15 times since the beginning of the war. Many of them do it in order to get alternative information. Third, according to independent journalists, Putin is now experiencing a serious image crisis. The Moscow Times reported that immediately after the Prigozhin mutiny, Kremlin began urgently drawing up an anti-crisis plan for Putin to fix his image. Finally, in recent years, Putin has begun to lose popularity among young people. He is not liked or understood by young audiences. It's very important. Putin is unpopular with Russian youth. For example, in January 2021, Putin's popularity rating among young people reached its lowest level in the history of observations. 46% of Russians aged from 18 to 24 disapproved of president's activities. Putin doesn't know how to speak the same language with young people as Alexei Navalny does. Putin doesn't understand technology, doesn't understand modern trends. He tells old anecdotes and makes non-politically correct jokes in his conversations with young people, and they don't understand it either. It's not an accident that in the last few years Putin got a new nickname, Grandpa. He was a sexy macho man and became a grandpa in the bunker. In other words, to the question of whether Putin is really popular, I would say this: he's still popular with the older generation that considers him the guy, tough and fair. At the same time, Putin is not at all popular with the youth. Anyway, a very large number of young people have already left or are going abroad, which means that Putin remains with his old electorate. People who support him more out of habit or because they don't see any alternative.
Dr. Turkova has some amazing content about the culture of Russia and Ukraine. Check out her channel in the pinned comments below. Now, regarding whether Russia's military is a joke, I've never said that Russia's military is a joke. Russia tends to be good at anything involving officers. But once it involves NCOs, they start screwing up. It's one of the reasons Russia doesn't have light infantry. In light infantry, you have NCOs that are constantly making decisions, and they just can't do that. Another good example of Russian NCOs screwing up is that video I just showed of a Russian casualty evacuation flight line, where there's trash all over the place and soldiers just lying out in the hot sun. Any American or NATO NCO would have flipped out and cleaned up that flight line and gotten those soldiers the shade that they needed. However, a good example of Russian officers performing competently is the retreat from Kherson. General Surovkin's river crossing is going to be studied at West Point for the next 20 years because this guy was able to do a river crossing and passage of lines, the two hardest things for any unit to do, and they pulled it off and saved a lot of their soldiers and equipment. So Russia does have a capacity for change. They eliminated battalion tactical groups. They're concentrating artillery. They're using drones for spotting. They're using electronic warfare. However, it is important to be realistic about their capabilities. Next up, Michael asks, could we repurpose 14 and 16-inch battleship guns for terrestrial use in Ukraine? So we do have battleship guns available. I think there's some at Naval Base Dahlgreen. Iowa battleships are museums, but I think they can be reactivated. In fact, the USS New Jersey just recently headed over to Philadelphia to be dry docked and refurbished. I believe the Navy requires dry docking and maintenance every 20 years on these battleships. The problem is that these battleship guns are big and heavy. So really, putting them on rail would be the only option for these guns. And that may have worked in World War I when you're just trying to throw around at Paris and have it land somewhere in Paris. But today, a rail-based gun would be a huge target and relatively immobile. We also have to talk logistics. You can only send a limited amount of stuff to Ukraine. So is it better to send a battleship gun or another HIMARS system? Because there's only so much space on the cargo planes going over there, on the rail units that are delivering the weapons into the country. So what's the better option? What's the biggest bang for your buck? And that probably isn't a battleship gun. Next, Rohit asks, would the USA/NATO be able to declare war on the Wagner Group without declaring war on Russia? Also, if Wagner attacked Poland from Belarus, would they declare war on and attack Wagner without declaring war on Belarus? So I don't see many countries declaring war anymore. I think the last formal war was the Iran-Iraq War of 1980. But I'm sure someone is going to let me know in the comments below that I'm wrong and that some country in Africa declared war or whatever. And if I'm wrong, please let me know. You can only declare war on nation states. Terrorists like the Wagner Group already fall under a civilian legal framework, so you don't need to declare war. I also don't think Poland would attack Wagner. But Poland could, I guess, theoretically declare war on Belarus for harboring terrorists. So perhaps they could also perform a strike at a Wagner camp without declaring war on Belarus and just deal with the political fallout. But honestly, if it ever came to that, Belarus would probably take care of the problem by themselves. President Lukashenko is going to do whatever he needs to do to stay in power. That's it. And if that means the Wagner Group gets out of line, he might send his own special forces in to attack the Wagner camp to let them know their place. So I don't really see Poland declaring war on Belarus or attacking the Wagner Group to be a viable option. Next, David asks, will a winter campaign against the trench line be easier due to Western support and no cover for the Russians? I don't think so. Attacking a minefield is like mowing the lawn and stopping every couple of meters to check to see if there's rocks under your lawnmower blades. And meanwhile, the neighborhood kid is throwing water balloons at you. And if the lawnmower gets hit with a water balloon, then you got to go to Home Depot and buy another one. Minefields are always being watched. The purpose of a protective minefield is to disrupt or delay. Watch my video on mines about that. That'll be available in the pinned comments below, and it'll also be available after this one. The only real difference is that between summer and winter is that in winter your fingers are going to be colder and it'll be harder to manipulate the demining equipment. There is no easy answer to the Russian minefield problem. F-16s can help by doing close air support against localized fighters that are protecting the minefield, but ultimately it's going to be a contest of brave young men versus hot metal. And right now the hot metal is buried in the ground and it kind of has the advantage. Finally, Ralph asks, when two adversaries closely matched in military prowess engage in a land-based conflict, do they always tend to revert to tactics such as trench warfare, reminiscent of historical conflicts and currently evident in situations like Ukraine? Not necessarily. It depends on the situation and the status of the armies. Really, I think whether those armies are at parity. The Iran-Iraq war that I just mentioned, that kind of devolved into trench warfare because Iran and Iraq were roughly at parity with their capabilities. But the Toyota war between Libya and Chad never devolved into trench warfare because Chad was highly mobile in their Toyota pickup trucks. So I think that warfare turns into trench warfare when you have two countries that are roughly at parity and they exhaust themselves going against each other. And while Russia has a larger military, Ukraine is able to punch above their weight with a more flexible command structure and modern weapons. So I don't think that everything devolves into trench warfare unless two nations that are at parity exhaust themselves. And that's it for the week. Thank you guys so much for watching.
Mr. President? Yeah, that's me. I'm the president, man. Hey, little tugboat, did someone drop your anchor? It's 3 o'clock in the morning, Mr. President. Well, it's not like you got some girl in bed with you to wake up. Listen, you freaking nerd. I've got a problem. It's my vice principal, man. You're who? Come on, man. Camilla. Miss Harris, if you're nasty. She's got a Nerf Day coming up, man. I gotta get her a presentation. Well, Mr. President, how about a Ryan McBeth t-shirt from Bunker Branding? I've got Think Outside the Bomb, Live, Laugh, Launch, Repatriate, N for HIMARS, Department of the Boat People, Landmine marker shirts, and even Hell on a Wire. A lot of these come in hoodies and stickers as well. Yeah, I'll get a Ryan McBeth t-shirt from Bunker Branding. McBeth, you saved the reputation of the Tight House. Not the Tight House, the Tight House. The building, man, with the Rose Garden. Get with the program, man. Happy to help, Mr. President. And be sure to get yours at bunkerbranding.com.